Welcome to The Exchange. I'm Dan Riley. The Exchange is a streaming internet talk show and podcast of interviews with noteworthy people about their lives, ideas, and current events. This week I sit down with Stanford Ph.D. candidate Francis Moore. During our conversation, Fran talks about the science of climate change, the history of governmental treaties to address global warming, and her research relating to the long-term economic costs of carbon emissions. Fran Moore, first of all, want to welcome to the show. Thank you so much for taking some time to talk to the listeners.
Thank you.
So I'd love to start just by learning about how you got interested in climate change as a subject. Was that something that you had learned about early in your academic background, or when was it that you became interested in the subject?
Well, I originally became interested in climate change very generally as an undergraduate when I studied geology. And in particular, I was studying paleoclimatology. So how has the climate changed in the past over very long geologic timescales? And my research was looking at the Cretaceous, so kind of when dinosaurs were around, and some big changes in planetary climate and ocean circulation that happened then. And so that, after graduation, I moved to Washington, D.C., and that kind of transitioned into an interest in the climate change we're seeing today and the policy solutions to that. And that's kind of, I've kind of kept going with that. And part of the reason I find climate change such a fascinating topic is that to understand the problem, you need to understand both the natural sciences, including how our climate system works, but also the social sciences of the politics and the economics that are involved. And so I just find it a kind of fascinating lens through which to study ourselves and our planet.
And what did you learn when you were studying the climate science or the geology of the Cretaceous period? I mean, what's the difference between then and now?
Well, what's interesting, the events I studied, which are called oceanic anoxic events, which basically means there were periods when it seems as though large sections of the ocean became what's called anoxic. So they had no oxygen dissolved in them. So, our oceans today, by and large, have a lot of oxygen in them. That's how fish can kind of survive in the ocean, right? And there's this evidence that this was not the case for substantial periods of time. And in particular, that the oceans seem to switch back and forth between these different states. And that these switches happen fairly fast. And so that's what I studied, but I think more generally what you can learn by looking at the geologic history of the planet is that these changes can happen very quickly on very large scales on the climate system. And we feel as though it's a kind of very large system that should be relatively stable, but we're kind of forcing it in a way that it's never been pushed before. And this kind of, you just by looking at the geologic record, this is going to have large scale consequences.
And when the dinosaurs were roaming the earth and existed, were there large swings in climate, the experience of the temperature of the planet experienced by dinosaurs at the time? Did it switch rather suddenly often, or what was it like?
Well, it's the one thing is that in that period the level of carbon dioxide are a lot higher than they are at present. And possibly that's some of the reason that you saw these big fluctuations in how the ocean was circulating. That these two things were kind of linked. In terms of temperature, I'm not really sure. The temperature was a lot higher because there was a lot more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So there were no ice caps, for example. But the trouble with the fluctuations is that you can't really cap. So we're raising temperature on a kind of decadal timescale, right? I mean, it's going up, and you can measure that with thermometers, right? But when you go back to the Cretaceous, what you're trying to use to measure this is is rocks, right? And the resolution of those rocks is not very high. So it's hard to capture these kind of the short-term fluctuations like we see with climate change today. But you do see bigger swings in a kind of longer time scales. You see fluctuations in temperature and bear in mind this is all this was there weren't any humans around putting CO2 into the atmosphere. So there's the Earth system is not necessarily a kind of stable, perfectly stable system, even without the forcing that humans are doing.
Let's move to today. So this issue of global warming or climate change. You mentioned that you lived in DC. Was that something when you moved to DC that was already a hot button issue? It was something that people were talking about, or was it still sort of in the background?
No, actually, when I moved there, which was 2006, it was a very kind of prominent issue. It was right around people had started. Over that time period, people were talking very much about the international climate negotiations, and there was a lot of discussion about what would happen kind of to replace the Kyoto Protocol that was due to expire. And so this was in the lead up to what was ultimately the Copenhagen climate negotiations. And so there was a lot of discussion about what should a global climate treaty look like that should replace Kyoto, and then what is the kind of U.S. role in that, given that the Congress, even at that time, I think it wasn't clear that it was clear there wasn't going to be a kind of major action on the part of Congress at that time.
What did Kyoto stand for? What did it do, and what were the proposals of the change of what the Copenhagen plan would look like?
Yeah, so Kyoto was really so. In 1992, there was an international agreement called the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, where all the countries, more or less, a lot of countries, agreed to avoid dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate. That's kind of the technical objective of the convention. And so the U.S. is a signatory to that, and so has that as official U.S. law that we want to try and avoid that. But the question is, how do you actually do that? And so in order to achieve the objectives of the convention, the countries negotiate to put in place actual protocols that are designed to achieve those objectives. And the Kyoto Protocol was the first protocol under the Framework Convention on Climate Change. And what it did was it more or less kind of committed the developed countries to reduce their emissions.
Carbon emissions.
CO2 emissions, yeah. And then developing countries could kind of voluntarily participate in reducing emissions through an offset trading scheme. And that was in place. It had to be ratified by a lot of countries. It was never ratified by the United States. So the United States was not a participant, was never participated in that protocol. But the European Union did, Russia did, Canada, Japan, Australia, most of the other developed nations were participating. And so that was in place from, I believe it was 2007 to it expired in 2012. Mm-hmm. And I think, what it was kind of a good first step to trying to do this. And what it was really trying to do was kind of look at emissions globally and allocate who should reduce emissions where and do it in this very top-down way. And I think what you're seeing emerge now is a much more of a bottom-up type of international climate policy, where you see countries kind of pledging, we think we can do this, we think we can do this, and hopefully in some way those are going to add up to something meaningful. But it's not totally clear that's the case. So, yeah.
And the countries that did sort of force themselves lawfully to abide by the Kyoto Protocol, did they themselves monitor their reduction in emissions, or how did they gauge whether or not they met their objectives?
Yeah, so it was all quantified, and so they're all measuring what what they're emitting, and the baseline was 1990, and so did you reduce by X% below 1990 levels? And so this was the EU set up a carbon market to try and do this, and other countries have tried to do it in other ways.
So they set the bar of how much carbon they were emitting in 1990, and then they wanted to make sure it was going downwards.
Yeah.
Was it 5% down or 10%?
Yeah, that's a good question. I can't tell you the answer off the top of my head.
Something in that
direction. It was something on the order of 5%, I think, below 1990. It was something kind of altogether.
And were these reductions that were recommended by the scientific community, or they were created by politicians?
Well, I mean, the scientists can't really tell you what you should do, you know? So the science can tell you that climate change is happening, and it can tell you that it's caused by humans, and it can tell you if you do this course, then these are the consequences. But the question of choosing among those different consequences is a kind of there's a lot of values involved in doing that. And kind of it's legitimately the domain of political discourse, you know, and so it was. I think it's targets that are to some extent informed by science, but they're not kind of scientific facts in the same way as, say, you know, the climate is warming and it's caused by humans. It's a scientific fact.
Right. So in the United States, you mentioned it wasn't ratified, and we never became legally bound to stand by the Kyoto Protocol. What was going on here that caused the pushback, or why was it that the U.S. didn't do it?
Yeah, so this is not totally my area of expertise, but this was in 1992. No, sorry, that's not right. I believe there was a Republican Congress, I'm pretty sure. And to get to ratify international agreements in the United States, you need to have a supermajority in the Senate. No, you need more than that. I think you need, you should probably not put this in, but I think you need 70 senators. I think you need even more than you need to break a filibuster, I'm pretty sure. And it's a really hard bar, right? And so it was always going to be difficult to do. And the Senate in particular did not like the idea that there would be mandatory emissions reductions for the developed country and no mandatory emissions reductions for developing countries, and kind of expressed the opinion in a letter to the president that any agreement that involved that kind of compromise would be unacceptable, and the Kyoto Protocol did that, and so I don't think it was even brought to the Senate for ratification.
And the countries, the developing countries, I would imagine that they were interested in locking into the Kyoto Protocol were countries like China, I would imagine. Yeah,
so it immediately got ratified by most of the developing countries because they kind of had not much to lose and some stuff to gain from it. And so they've participated through what's called the Clean Development Mechanism, which is, so if I'm a country and I need to reduce my emissions, but it would be quite expensive for me to do so, I could go to, say India and invest and pay them to reduce their emissions through some projects, and then take those credits and take those emissions reductions and use them as a credit for my own obligations.
So from that time to now, the early 90s until today, or maybe the time when you got to DC, it seems like the issue of global warming and climate change did grow, at least in public recognition, not necessarily in unanimity or agreement by the public. Was it really an inconvenient truth, you think, that really spurred that conversation, or what few things do you think were responsible for bringing it to the public's attention?
Yeah, I think around that time you saw a few things. So Inconvenient Truth came out, and that, I think, it did get a lot of attention. To some extent, I think it maybe polarized the debate in a way that was not necessarily helpful. I think because you saw Al Gore up there making this argument, a lot of people, it became much more of this is a democratic issue rather than this is something that we should all be worried about. You also, around that time, saw the release of the fourth assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. that came out in 2007, and you also saw kind of Al Gore and the IPCC be awarded the Nobel Prize. And there was a kind of nexus of positivity around doing something around climate change right around that time, and I think we kind of almost felt, oh, we've solved this issue of establishing climate change as a fact, and then I think after that you saw some of those gains somewhat go away. And I think now that's starting to change again. Yeah.
What did the report say? The 2007 report. What was in it?
Well, I mean, do you want to talk about that, or there's been a more recent report since then?
Let's start there and then.
Okay. So that's a tough question because it's a very long report, but more or less it said climate change is happening, and it is probably caused by humans. And then in the more recent report, you saw climate change is definitely happening, and it's very likely caused by humans. And so the overall, what you've seen is that the overall scientific understanding has not changed, but the confidence with which we can make these statements has increased over time. And so, yeah.
You mentioned the phrase climate change. I've used both climate change and global warming. What's the difference? Is it just the same thing being used in different contexts for different reasons, or what? Is there a difference between climate change and global warming?
I don't kind of have strong feelings about that distinction. I think some people feel that climate change is a more accurate description because it encompasses lots of different changes rather than simply warming temperatures, and that it's kind of inaccurate to associate the problem of climate change simply with warming, which some people might understand by the phrase global warming. Because
in reality, the Earth is warming, but it's also doing other things as well. Is that right?
Yeah.
How about more recently? One of the subjects I wanted to cover with you is the economic impact of climate change, and a report that you co-authored. Before I do that, I'd love to talk about an issue you brought up earlier, which is that prior to humans actually existing, as you mentioned, there were massive changes in climate. What's the reason that there is a growing scientific confidence that it really is human caused, that we are playing truly a role in what's happening in the change of the climate?
So there's multiple lines of evidence for this, right? So I think one thing that's important to understand is that there's no one piece of evidence that leads us to this conclusion. It's a whole range of different lines of evidence that point to the same conclusion, and that's why we can have confidence. And even if one of those turned out not to be true, there's all other reasons to believe this. So one really obvious point is just that the rate of change that we're seeing is so different from what we've seen in the past, and that so even though you could, I was kind of saying you can have these very rapid changes on geological timescales. Geological timescales are still, fastest 10,000 years. So the fact that we're able to measure changes in global temperature over the course of decades is really unusual. That's the rate of change that you do not see in kind of natural processes at the global scale. There's all sorts of other lines of evidence. Well, a very simple one is we know we're putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and we've known for over 100 years that carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas that traps the outgoing radiation from the Earth's surface and emits it back to the surface. And so, if it weren't raising temperature, there would be a lot of explaining to do. The energy that's associated with that needs to be going somewhere, and if it's not raising the temperature of either the surface or the ocean, then there's a big question mark about what exactly is going on. And so we would have to kind of reevaluate a lot of our other understandings of pretty basic physics and chemistry. And there's all kinds of other reasons. A big reason is that the reason we know the warming we're seeing is due to greenhouse gases as I say, greenhouse gases trap outgoing radiation, right, and reflect it and emit it back to the surface. And because of that, what they do is they warm the lower part of the atmosphere, but they cool the upper part of the atmosphere because they're preventing radiation that would otherwise warm the higher parts of the atmosphere. And that's exactly what you see when you look at the long-term temperature trends, that we've seen a warming here at the surface, but if you look higher up, in the stratosphere, you actually see a cooling. And that's very consistent with the pattern of warming you'd expect from greenhouse gases.
You mentioned just the pace of change and the pace of the alteration of the climate is just so much larger than in geological time spans. Is that change specifically in the change of global temperatures or something else?
I mean, global temperatures is the one that, firstly, it's very easy. It's easy for us to measure today, or easier than it's a metric that's fairly easily measured, and it's also a metric that for which we have fairly good proxies. So we don't have thermometers that go back millions of years. No. So instead, you look at particular signatures in rocks or old corals or tree rings. That can tell you about temperature. And so there's a fair number that are fairly good at telling you about temperature. And so that's why that's kind of been a focus. So yeah, mostly it's about temperature.
And how quickly is the temperature increasing? And is it everywhere in the world is going up?
Yeah, so on average, the amount of warming we've seen over the last about 130 something years, so since the start of the Industrial Revolution, is about 0.8 degrees Celsius.
Per year?
No, altogether. Yeah, so globally, 0.8 degrees Celsius. And to put that in perspective, the difference between globally, in terms of the global average temperature, the difference between an ice age and an interglacial, which is what we're in now, is on the order of about 1 degree Celsius, or might be slightly less. So that's the kind of the magnitude that we're talking about. So even though it seems like not a large number, it's really pretty large when you're talking about global average temperature. And then you have seen increases everywhere, but you see larger increases in certain locations. And in particular, you see larger increases in the Arctic, because there you have this process of, it's called albedo feedback. And so albedo is just how much of incoming sunlight is reflected off the Earth rather than absorbed. And if it's absorbed, then it heats up the Earth. So in the Arctic, you have a lot of ice and snow, and that reflects a lot of sunlight. But as the temperature warms, you get less and less ice and snow. And so more and more incoming radiation is absorbed, and that makes it hotter, which provides its feedback. And so in the Arctic, you see rates of warming that are about 3 to 4 times faster than the global average.
You mentioned that some numbers since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. Is the pace of the increase in temperature going up in recent years, in the last 10, 20, 30 years?
That's a good question. I believe the answer would probably be no, because climate is a long-term phenomena, and then if you're thinking about changes in climate, then you're already thinking about very long time scales. And there are variations in the Earth system associated with oscillations in the ocean and atmosphere that can occur over fairly large kind of decadal timescales. Mm-hmm. And so what you've seen over the last 15 years is what's come to be called a hiatus in warming, where the rates of warming have actually slowed fairly substantially, and it's unclear why that is. There's a lot of fairly clear evidence it's probably got something to do with oceanic circulation and the fact that we really haven't had a strong El Nino in the last decade and a half. And in addition, there's some evidence that there's been a kind of increase in volcanic activity, and volcanoes put out sulfur dioxide, which tends to cool the planet. And so some combination, possibly related, of the two of those is probably responsible for this, but it's definitely an area of active research. And
even though maybe the rate of increase is decreasing, is the temperature overall still going up to some degree?
Yeah, so you saw 2014 is kind of in most records. I think in all the global temperature records now is the hottest year on record, and regionally. And you see records being broken really consistently. And if you look at the ratio of warm records being broken to cold records, it's much in favor of the warm records, which is very much what you'd expect with consistent with global warming.
Mm-hmm. So we live in a country where there's some serious disagreement about what's going on with climate change, and not only what's going on, but what should be done about it. You co-wrote a paper about sort of the economic impact of how the climate is changing and what that will mean for our economy. What have we learned? What are your conclusions that you've reached from your research?
Yeah, so what we were doing in this paper is we were looking at the quantity called the social cost of carbon, and that the social cost of carbon is simply the economic damage associated with an additional ton of carbon dioxide. And so if I emit 1 ton of CO2 today, that's going to have effects, for decades into the future, and I'm going to add all those up and discount them, into the future, which just means things that happen far into the future I don't worry about as much. And add them all up and come up with one number, and that's called the social cost of carbon. And it's equivalent to, economically, the tax, the efficient tax that you would put on carbon dioxide emissions. So when people talk about a carbon tax, the level at which you would want to do that would be equal to the damages associated with each ton of CO2. And the values that have been around in the literature have been around $30 to $40 per ton of carbon dioxide. And the value used by the US government in a kind of they went through an official process where they came up with a number is $37 per ton. And so what my co-author and I did in this paper was to look at some new evidence that's been recently published showing that climate change might directly affect economic growth rates. And this is something that the models have kind of assumed was not the case, and that instead climate damages simply fall on your output in a given year, but that otherwise your ability to grow and develop is basically unaffected by climate change. And the reason that's so important is that if you have effects on economic growth, they really add up year over year to come up to really large numbers. And so what we did was take one of these estimates that's in the literature as to how large these effects were, and put it into an economic model of climate change to come up with a new value of the social cost of carbon. And we found that value increased by about 6 times. So our estimated value is about $220 per ton.
And that's long-term damage. Is that right? Is that for the duration of having that carbon in the atmosphere? How that would affect an economy?
Yeah. So the emissions go up, and a lot of the carbon dioxide stays in the atmosphere for a very long time, and it has a kind of continuing effect on the economy. But you do discount into the future, and so economically, those very long run effects tend to not be so important. And so that's been a kind of source of debate in the climate economics literature about how much should you discount. But we find even using standard discount rates of about 3% per year, that it's still the damages associated with climate change is still very large.
So you said 6 times the $35, $37 amount, so a couple $100 per ton.
Yeah.
I was mentioning before we did the interview that I read an article in the National Geographic about a month ago regarding projected damage to one state in the U.S. of Florida, primarily to the coastal cities like Miami and Tampa. And I think primarily they were focusing on the damage that would take place in regards to real estate. And the projections were something like by the end of the century, it would be in the hundreds of billions of dollars of damage potentially. Do you find that, you mentioned earlier that people see Al Gore giving a PowerPoint presentation about a subject and immediately think that's a Democratic issue. For fiscal conservatives that are generally voting Republican, do you find that there's an increased interest in learning about these things because that's going to affect their bottom line?
Yes, I think it's true that to the extent people are beginning to feel the effects of climate change, that they want to do something about it. The question of whether what they want to do about it is reduce emissions, or is what they want to do about it kind of build protection along the coast to protect their house, they're the two quite different responses. And one of them, in order to kind of protect coastal Florida, you can kind of try and do that without necessarily making much of an argument around climate change. You can kind of say, well, look, the seas are rising, they might keep rising, and we need to do something about it. And you don't necessarily need to convince people of climate change in order to do that. In order to get people mobilized around actually reducing greenhouse gas emissions, you really need to make that connection that the impacts you're seeing here and now are related to greenhouse gas emissions. And that's a pretty tough, scientifically and just at the communication point of view, that's a kind of tough thing to do. One example, I spent a lot of time studying agriculture as well. And, people always ask me, I study how farmers adapt to climate change. And people always ask me, well, we wouldn't expect to see adaptation in the US because, farmers tend to be a conservative bunch and they tend to not believe in climate change. But I think, you look at what farmers do and how they respond to changing weather conditions, and it's pretty clear that they're going to be adapting to climate change as it happens, independent of whether, if you ask them, do you believe in climate change, whether they say yes or no, because it is a bottom line issue.
Do you find that they're already adapting, and do you also find that they're changing their mind about climate change?
Well, so I look mainly in Europe, and it's really hard to tell. What we can say is that it looks like climate trends, so changes, long-term changes in climate appear to have affected yields in Europe and have particularly severe impacts in certain locations. What you can't tell from that data is whether or not people have been adapting to that. So I think something I'd like to do in the future is go to those regions and start talking to people, actually ask them whether or not they've experienced these changes.
So here we are in 2014, and this issue is coming up in many nations on Earth, including this one. Do you think from here on out, there are things that we can do to primarily avert the problem altogether? Do you think we're at a point where we're going to have to deal with at least some of the major consequences and adapt from there? Where kind of are we in terms of the range of possibilities of what we as Americans and as human beings can do?
I mean, I think it's easy to be very pessimistic about this, but I don't think that's the case. I think we still have a lot of options open to us, and I think what we do need is for globally for emissions to begin declining. And to the extent you can slow the rate of emissions growth and gradually cause it to peak and start declining, you're going to make a major advance in terms of limiting the overall temperature increase over the next century. Does that mean there won't be any impacts? No, but to the extent you can try and manage the level of temperature increase, you can then make those impacts much more manageable and kind of keep them within the realm of things we could kind of plausibly and with, fairly little disruption or cost be able to adapt to. Yeah.
As I understand it, the way that scientists view the carbon count in terms of a metric is parts per million. Mm-hmm. That is, that's a measurable quantity that we can fairly accurately know. Mm-hmm. Where are we right now, and where do we need to be?
I think so. I'm pretty sure that the kind of the measurement station in Hawaii that measures this has been measuring concentrations above 400 parts per million for kind of few months now. And so when I was learning about this originally, when I was back in undergrad, everything was about 380 parts per million, and that was where we were. So over the course of about 10 years, we've increased by 20 parts per million. And a lot of the metrics you see are around a doubling of CO2. And so that would get you up to 560 parts per million. And we're pretty sure we definitely don't want to be there. Mm. And so, but in between, there's a big kind of gap as to where exactly should we be and where should we be aiming. And the governments have agreed to try and limit temperature increase to 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And in order to do that, it's pretty clear you need to start reducing emissions fairly soon, as in the next 5 to 10 years. The way I see it is the more you do, the earlier, the better. And there's no kind of one threshold above which impacts are terrible and below which there are no impacts. I mean, It's a gradation, and there are definitely some nasty things that could happen at the higher levels of warming. But the more you can do, the better. And we certainly should be doing more than we're doing right now. It seems pretty clear. And so how do you start getting moving, and then how do you kind of ratchet it up as you show that it's possible and not as costly as I think people are worried about?
Part of the show has been about economics, and I think one of the major concerns that people have, rightly or wrongly, about doing something about global warming or climate change is that it would impact our economy. People might lose jobs, etc. Are there models in the world that you would look to, countries in the world that you would look to, who have sort of approached this issue in the right frame of mind, understanding that this is potentially a jobs issue, but it's also sort of a moral and huge social issue that we're facing too?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, there are some models out there for certain types of policy. I think California is actually one, particularly for energy efficiency. If you look at kind of what the average Californian is responsible for in terms of energy use, it's much lower than the national average, and that was through a series of policies that came in force, after I think in the 1980s and 1990s, that gradually ratcheted up and gradually made people more aware of energy efficiency, buy new energy efficient appliances, and over time those actions, they seem very small, but they really add up to pretty big numbers. I think in terms of deployment of renewables, you can kind of look to Germany, that's seen big gains in its solar industry, largely through a lot of subsidies. But you wouldn't normally think of Germany as a hotbed of solar power, and yet they have large capacity installed there for solar power. And so none of these is kind of enough by itself, but I think we're starting to see enough action that you can look at it and see that this is this could be the way forward.
The last question I want to ask you is about individual people. We were just talking about individual countries, but what can feasibly an individual person do to sort of be on the right side of this issue from your perspective?
I mean, I think there are a lot of individual actions that probably people are fairly well aware of at this point. Be cognizant of energy use. I think a big one from a personal standpoint is eating less meat. That might be something people aren't aware of, but greenhouse gas emissions from livestock are fairly large, and I think for some people it might be a major component of their carbon footprint. But I think you need, at this point, especially for people that have been worried about this for a while, we're probably almost tapped out on doing those things, and I think being aware that this is a collective problem and it's a collective action problem, and that you need to be exerting pressure on your elected representatives who are responsible for this or responsible for doing something about this collectively, and writing letters and lobbying and getting involved in that way is important at this point in US in the US political scene.
One follow-up on that. I know you were mentioning, eating less meat would be a way to reduce your carbon footprint. And I assume that's because of just the amount of transportation costs it takes to not only transport livestock, but also to raise them. What are the major sources of fossil fuel emissions in the world? What are the top 2, 3, or 4 that do exist right now?
Yeah, well, so livestock, it's some of the transportation, but there's a lot also, they emit a lot of methane. Mm-hmm. Cows and the waste from feedlots and things is responsible for a lot of methane, which is a really powerful greenhouse gas. So, but in terms of globally, where do greenhouse gas emissions come from? There's so the transportation sector. So oil, by and large, is used in the transportation sector. And in the US, I want to say that's about 25% of emissions. The energy sector is big. The electricity sector is large, and that's a lot of coal. And coal is for each unit of power that it produces a lot of greenhouse gas emissions, and so that's a big source of emissions. And then natural gas is also a kind of component of that too. Land use change. So globally, deforestation might be around 15% of emissions. So that's kind of cutting down and burning forests. Other similar sources like peatland, to the extent you're converting peat, you emit a lot of, you allow a lot of carbon to escape soils. And then some industrial uses. So, to the extent industry is using its own power, or cement production also releases CO2 directly. And so that's a kind of fairly small component globally. But transportation and then heating. So kind of direct burning of fossil fuels for heating is another big component.
Fran, thank you so much for taking the time and coming on the show. I really appreciate it.
No, thank you so much.
Thanks for listening. If you're interested in learning more about The Exchange, want to listen to episodes online, or would like to reach out to the show, feel free to visit the show's website at theexchangeshow.com.